welcome back to Varn Blog, and now we're in our less structured, organic response and back and forth panel um, here, and we still have Nico, we have Paul, we have Jeff, and we have Michael, all from the DSA, and then Tyler representing New Zealand and international criticism, and me representing the person in the room who hasn't been convinced to join the DSA in 15 years. And
but tonight's night, right?
Yeah, originally the panel was gonna be, you had another convention, convinced me to join Jeremy, and then I figured that was a dick move. Um, so we were going to talk about some of the challenges that are emerging with the DSA, and I'm going to start us out with the obvious thing that has emerged kind of lately, is that electorally speaking, DSA candidates have not done as well on these off-cycle elections as they have priorly. The Nina Turner election, which her loss was interestingly spun. I was a member of this Reddit group where I literally had to leave because it was called the Contrarian Left, and it was leftists like critiquing Contrarian Left, but the mission drift moved from critiquing the Contrarian Left, which are like, leftists who pick up running talking points, to everybody who's not a Joe Biden Democrat. And it was literally, I could see the tone change. And it was funny because they painted Nina Turner's loss as a racial issue, with the socialists were race blind, which I found hilarious. Because I actually looked at the numbers. Nina lost in the suburbs. So, and the racial divide was not as clean as it looked. Also, both candidates were black, so it's hard to pin it on that. But it wasn't just Nina that lost. If we're honest, we've had formerly endorsed people lose office. I think their endorsement was retracted in the case of that one person from Virginia, whose name slipped my mind right now.
Lee Carter.
Yeah, Lee Carter. But a lot of the
other
lot
going on with Lee.
Huh?
There was a lot going on with him.
Yeah, it's a complicated situation, but I don't think he lost because of all the stuff that came out on Twitter. I think it was other stuff.
No, I mean, he was too focused on the governor's race and didn't really campaign locally for his own seat.
But so there's 1,000 things going on there electorally, right? But the one thing we learned is the DSA was doing better and better from 2016 to 2019. That seems to be reversed. The other thing I can say is the centrist Democrats have always had a strange position towards the squad of originally 4, now I'd say 6. And there was a lot of chastising that happened between House terms we know about, with AOC losing committee seats and whatnot. And her tone did change. I don't like to do the AOC stan hate game because I find it to be a waste of time. But I do think we have to look at the way the National Democrats are beginning to reorient towards the candidates that have DSA endorsements. And it does seem like the National Party doesn't have use for you anymore. Although it also seems like even with what the moderate end of the DSA, Bread and Roses, for example, I consider fairly moderate as far as the socialist opinion go. I'd put it in the center. And of socialist opinion, guys, don't come at me. I'm not saying they're centrist. That they are also beginning to feel the feeling is mutual, right? That there's not a whole lot to be gained from playing super nice with the National Dems. But that does leave the DSA in kind of a lurch electorally, because we all know that running third-party candidates in places where there are partisan elections, you can run them in places where there aren't, like city councils, states that don't require partisan which is pretty much ends up in a city almost everywhere. Where you won third party there, it doesn't matter because those aren't partisan elections really. But on partisan elections in most states, if you're a third party, you basically have to have a force of God like local political machine like Bernie Sanders was able to build in Burlington to do that, and that requires resources that most people don't have. Why do you think why do you think some of these elections didn't go well for the DSA this round?
I will say that we did have one really good thing happen this year. We had India Walton win the Buffalo mayor primary and probably win the mayorship properly, which, by the way, Buffalo DSA has a big class unity contingent. But why things don't? I mean, electoralism is hard. There's a lot of people running against us. Our biggest wins are usually in people who are unprepared, or we have like an element of surprise against.
So urban areas that are largely democratic but don't have strong democratic machines is what you're kind of describing, actually.
Or machines that are breaking down.
Right.
Well, what metrics are we using for, a good number of victories versus not good? Because I was listening to Adolph Reed, and like he made a good point of like if you pull off like a baseball average, if you win like 3 out of 10 elections, that's actually really good. And so in that case, you're going to lose 60% of the time. And then there's like kind of a different question of like what constitutes a DSA candidate versus just like a DSA endorsed. Because is Nina Turner a DSA candidate as like the same way like Rashida Tlaib is a DSA candidate, where Rashida Tlaib is literally a DSA member, or India Walton. And so like I think those kind of questions are also we have to take into account, because we have to expect we're going to lose some elections, right? And we're going to lose like some big elections too. And I don't want that to like be as like a way of like saying, oh, okay, it doesn't matter, that these left candidates lose. But I think like also putting things in perspective of like what's a good electoral victory, or like how what percentage is a good amount versus what's not, I think is always kind of important to keep in mind.
That was in fact the kind of thing that we were debating during this convention. There were some contentious electoral resolutions, which I personally supported, precisely because there is not widespread agreement about what is a DSA candidate, what counts as success, who should run, who should not run. There's none of that agreement across the organization. And I thought the resolutions that were defeated were actually quite reasonable, because they basically said, if you are running, you should run as an explicit, like, I am a DSA candidate, I am running as a DSA candidate, I'm friends with the DSA, you should join DSA, et cetera, because there's been lots of cases where, there's a person associated with DSA, but they don't really follow up. And I would count those cases as I would count those as losses, not wins, even if the person actually wins. I mean, a notable, well, I know we said we weren't going to mention AOC, but it's worth noting that AOC doesn't talk about DSA enough. And, my chapter, we have some local electeds. My delegation had a local elected with me. I know personally another local elected DSA member. They're not bad people. The disagreement is this ultimately worth our time in the present moment, given that, for example, we have, what is it, like 300, 600 people in the New Hampshire state legislature. And it's like we have a handful of individual DSA members, but no DSA caucus. And it's all very like, if we did it differently, the numbers wouldn't matter. If we were more focused, it wouldn't matter as much. But at present, it's sort of like we have our individual electeds, but they kind of vanish in a sea of opposition. And I don't know. I'll leave it there because I don't want to ramble.
The elephant in the room to me is that the DSA has no accountability mechanism and could not have any accountability mechanism compared to a counterforce that is a Democratic Party, nor do you have a programmatic line to hold anyone accountable to.
We do have a
We did
party
drop our
program.
time
You
ever.
did?
But we don't
Ooh.
hold anyone accountable because we didn't
Not
pass
yet.
CB8.
It's got to step through that process. I mean, we've never had a program before. Now we do. There was a debate and discussion on holding people accountable to that. I think we were not ready as a body, at least the constituted delegation that showed up to convention. We weren't prepared to hold people specifically to that line quite yet, but I think it's a step forward.
That's good. Actually, that is good.
I think it would have been skipping a step, actually, having come from this convention, having said, okay, fine, we have our first ever platform, and we're going to hold people directly accountable for it. We need to get used to having a platform first. Like, sorry, I'm
platform or program? That's actually okay. I know that's okay. Can we talk about what's in it a little bit?
Yep.
Since we passed up, you guys, not we, because I'm not part.
I hear what you're saying. Yeah, you're one of us. One of us.
But
was there any? Oh,
go ahead.
I was just asking if there were any significant changes from the draft because I only saw the original draft.
I read the draft and didn't hate it.
It was amended.
There was the Green New Deal section passed, I believe. International section passed, correct?
It all passed.
Oh, yeah. So international section, and then there was a public banking part. So it's like a 20-page document.
I was hoping they would have shortened it.
I think it actually got a little longer with the amendments.
Considerably longer.
Well, so then you need to turn it to an agitprop committee just to make the key points shorter. That's not hard. But
right, which is why, by the way, is like we're not ready to hold people accountable to it because nobody knows the fuck's in it. If you're not a delegate, and like most delegates even don't know what's in it. So like the idea of holding somebody accountable to this program, like when you just adopted it, is, I mean, like I said before, it's skipping steps.
But I do have a question. I mean, there's a question. There's a bunch of questions here that come into my mind. One is, so DSA now has a program. It's acceptable. It's, and a representative caucus of 100,000 people. Representative convention. A plebiscite or whatever. But you're gonna have to see, like, its organic relationship to class is a little questionable, and there's a bunch of demographic reasons for that. We talked about this off air. I don't want to go into some of the stuff we talked about off air because it's off air stuff. But the interesting thing about who's in the DSA is fascinating. It's way more queer than the general population. It's slightly richer. It's slightly, but it is.
No, you're right. You're right.
The idea that it is a lot of people who are downwardly mobile from middle class and upper middle class positions does seem to be holding out. It is regionally concentrated in areas where you can run a shoe with a D on it and win. There are exceptions to that. Like Louisiana's chapter is actually quite large. And that is not a D shoe on those. And
even though it looks like a shoe.
Yeah. It's more like a waterlogged R that just happens to be bloated and kind of looks like a D. But it's interesting that when you look at that, you have the organic relationship to the working class. Now, the DSA has made, and I'm going to give it credit for this, real inquiries into working with more unions, but it's hard to work with the unions that currently exist. And then we need to talk about like how much of the workforce is in them and what that workforce actually looks like. Because the union movement in the United States, if we are honest, is 17% of it's 17% of the workforce of people who are actively employed.
I think it's like 12.
It's that high?
I think it's like, it's 10 to 13, I think.
I've heard it. I've heard it. It depends on how you look at it. So it's gotten lower.
Maybe
worse.
I'm surprised if it's as high as you said. I hope. I mean,
it might be depending on what unions we're counting.
metric you're using.
Yeah, because with some places some places count professional organizations like teachers orgs in places that you cannot legally have a state union.
Yeah.
And some don't. So I would actually really have to look at the numbers, but it's bad. Regardless,
Not good. America sucks for unions.
But if we're
Well, it does everywhere.
I was about to say
It does everywhere. That's the exact same tendency as is happening in most of the advanced capital as well. New Zealand is very similar. There's not the actual representation for unions is somewhere in the 15% area.
All right.
But I think
Anyway.
the UK has because I looked at this because I went on like a wild research rant. I think the UK has like 30% union rate or something, 35. And like even with if our unionization rate was much higher, like was it Norway? I think in its heyday was like 75%, something pretty outlandish. So from the
countries had up to 75%, but when those unions were incorporated into the state apparatus, membership actually declined. So I mean, and what is something you have to like, if you poll the working class where people are allowed to unionize, unions are also pretty fucking unpopular. When they're not allowed to unionize, they're really popular. And so, so in the United States, unions are actually becoming popular again, partly because no one's in them. And we all know that things were better when people were in them. But when I hear people in the DSA sometimes talk about unions, I'm always like, have you been in one? But
it also changes radically, right? From union to union. Like police unions are definitely not left-leaning. Teacher unions probably are. And like, construction unions are probably.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what you said about cop unions and teacher unions.
Oh, cop unions are definitely not left unions. So even and that's counted, right?
Teacher unions
Whereas,
are
like,
all over the place. Actually, the
are
unions
they?
here in Utah
Talking
are.
to AFT specifically, I mean, like, Randy Weingarten keeps a pretty tight rein in terms of like direction of the organization, and she's squarely in Camp Democrat. I mean, like. Right. Squarely.
The issue is the NEA and the NEA subsidiary unions are, which is what I'm in. The AFT has no bargaining power in my state. Is that they tend to be locally oriented in such a way that we're encouraged to vote GOP a lot, to vote moderate GOP, but that's what they encourage us to do. It's something that you have to really deal with and look at. The AFLC, one of the things I was about to say there was like the DSA does have good relations with a few unions, but not with the AFL-CIO. And the reason why is obvious, because the AFL-CIO, if we are completely fucking honest, is a lobbying organization for the Democrats at the national level. And at the local level, it does what it does. And we kind of the way some people accuse the DSA of being to make a low blow, but which I don't know that that's still true in the case of the DSA, but it's definitely the case in the AFL-CIO unions, and it leads to it. Like one of the things that I remember, like during the George Floyd, is the calling for the AFL-CIO to keep out the fraternal order police and the police unions, and the AFL-CIO literally can't. All right, and I'll tell you why it can't. Because the largest unions are, do you know? I mean, teaching, cops,
firefighters, government employees,
nurses.
Yeah,
and that's basically all my state has. Like my state's pretty typical it's a state that doesn't have a lot of unions. And like I looked once, I was like, I want to get a unionized job. And I looked, and literally it was like teachers, cops, that's it.
So I mean, it's and teachers unions do tend to be more liberally oriented, but not everywhere. Like the branches of the UEA, depending on if they're urban or rural, side with the cop unions on endorsements all the time out here. My personal chapter does not, but that's just my personal chapter, and we have a different demographic mix.
My local basically votes along the lines of AFL, like the Great New Orleans AFL-CIO constantly. And when, we basically get some amount of say, the teachers union, and we're a huge union actually in the state. We're the biggest teachers union in the state of Louisiana, my local. But there's this sort of deference to the rest of labor that, sometimes we'll even get pushed around on our own turf, like school board type stuff. It's kind of interesting.
What I find fascinating is I've been talking to people about local ground game, and you would think this would be an area where socialist organizers would be stronger. And I mean that in the disrupting and fucking shit up way. And by that I don't mean like burning stuff down and rioting. I mean like the way right wing groups do, which is they keep local government kind of perpetually terrified in the areas around a city, and I don't mean because of violence, because of just sheer disruption.
Mm-hmm.
I think the violent threat is a lot of overstated because you're mostly talking about like upper middle class suburban moms. But they can do it, and they do it. And I don't ever see a counterforce at these. I don't see like leftists come out to like yell back at them at the local level where it would actually be efficient. What I see leftists doing is going out and marching in the streets and like doing their parade.
And going away.
Which they do ritually, and they've done ritually since the 60s, frankly, and it has not mattered one bit. It only really matters when there's a riot, and frankly, even the riots have a limit. The riots have a limit. They're not organizational tools; they're expressions of outrage. When people are like, "Oh, you're against riots," I'm like, "Oh, I'm not against riots, but it's like being against the rain." I mean, it's not anything in and of itself. It's how you would use it. And the way I saw it used was quite interesting. I mean, the DSA seemed kind of not involved. I mean, they of course were big when the George Floyd protests were on. They had good things to say about them. That's not really my point. But like, they weren't able to help like pivot it into anything as things slowed down. And there were attempts to. I mean, there were a lot of attempts to do things like social unionizing, to do stuff around occupying abandoned buildings and taking care of homeless people. But for a variety of reasons, most of them opened themselves up to legal challenges and stuff, frankly, because a lot of drug issues were involved. And the media wasn't interested in that. They were interested in Chaz. They were interested in Portland. And while I don't want to disparage Portland, it did seem like what was going on there was of a markedly different and more performative turn in the way it was being portrayed by the media. Whether or not that's what it was on the ground, and I've heard different things from different people in Portland, right? Is a completely different matter. But it is interesting and hard for people to explain why the literal whitest city in America, and Portland is, you can look it up, it's the whitest large metropolitan area in the country, was ground zero for racial fights in the second half of BLM. It felt like something had moved, and there were opportunist elements who were able to seize in on that immediately and push back. And in some ways they had grounds, and it's something that the DSA was not, and I don't know if we should have expected it to be fair. It just seemed like it was just kind of having to ride the wave with everybody else.
Well, I mean, I know people who are in that kind of black bloc, who were, at least I used to know people who were involved in the black bloc kind of stuff, and who were marginally involved in DSA as well. I think the internal idea is kind of to keep those separate, or like anything related to something like that, to those mass riots or protests, has to be kind of unofficial. And I'm not really sure what the DSA could do officially about it to really maximize the gain. And it's based on, I mean, it's fundamentally unsustainable as like a source of change.
No, agreed. Absolutely agreed. It is something that we have to deal with. I mean, like, if you look at the history of strikes and riots, they usually go together. We often pit it as either or, but historically it's usually actually both. Particularly successful strike waves, and that are not about individual worksite negotiations, because individual worksite negotiation strikes have an entirely different logic. And if you do political striking involved with them, you actually legally undermine them in the United States. Like, it's against Taft-Hartley to do most of those things. What I will say, and then I want to talk a little bit about something that Taylor brought up, is the DSA's had a weird relationship with Trotskyist organizations at the same time where, like, internet Stalinism seems to be a real tendency that's come back. And come back as I have met high school Stalinists. I never met high school Stalinist, most of my life until the last 3 years. And I don't mean like online, I mean in person as a teacher.
Yeah.
Are they like real Stalinists though, or is it just like a way of like defending socialism, communism via the Soviet Union?
Well, were they alt-right will Nazis?
Have you seen any Hoxists IRL? That's the real question. Or Hojists?
No, I mean, to be fair, no, they're not actually parroting all the positions of the historical anti-revisionist parties. Absolutely not.
Sounds like a bunch of Strasserite in here, honestly.
I have actually met real life Hojists, and I'm in New Zealand, so they
That's
do
amazing.
exist. Yeah.
Did you know that the problems in Ethiopia are in part caused by like ex-Hojists who basically became super ethnic nationalists, which is why all the ethnic groups in Ethiopia are fighting each other? I just had to say that.
So one of the things I would actually say in develop, like, to maybe get back to the DSA topics and some things that we've seen, though, is why does it seem like the DSA has been dependent on what has had to happen is either organizations who either had to agree to dual card with them, even ones that were historically hostile. And I'm not just talking about Trotsky was here, like their RF Freedom Road Socialist Organization, Stalinist branch, not the Social Democratic branch.
So confusing.
I think the Social Democratic branch maybe changed their name, but I'm not 100% sure. There's so many different stupid orgs. I mean, stupid. Yeah,
I know what you mean.
Yeah, I shouldn't be against left unity, but some of these don't need to exist. But I think even they do card with the DSA now. Whereas I think the PSL is the only group that really doesn't. But a lot of the groups have died, and the deaths of these sectarian organizations have led to influxes into the DSA, but they come with a completely different culture. Is that good or bad? What do you guys make of that? Like, I mean, because sometimes it feels like the DSA at the local level, not at the national level, is like a clearinghouse of sectarian organizations where everybody's just like, well, we're stronger together than apart, but we're not really together. We're just going to show up to these meetings and then like do our own thing afterwards.
Something I'll say on that is that it's happening in the context of Trotskyism declining across at least the English-speaking advanced capitalist world. Like, that's not a phenomena restricted to the US. That's occurring in Canada, that's occurring in the UK, that's occurring in New Zealand. It's occurring in the smaller ones in Australia, although the largest Australian group, Socialist Alternative, which was very loosely affiliated with the ISO US, remains the largest one there. But it's something that's happening all over the place. And if they're going to go to a different organization, the other Trotskyist organizations are in decline, and they're not going to join a Marxist-Leninist or a Maoist group. The natural place to go is something like DSA.
Although some of them do. I mean, in America, the largest Marxist-Leninist group started out as Trotskyist parties. I just want to point that out. So, I mean, historically, I mean, one of them will deny it because they're split away, but still. Is this good? I mean, for one thing, is it good to be... If an organization grows based off sectarianism, less sectarianism has a very small natural limit. Like let's be honest. Like how many basement dwellers like ourselves are actually out there?
More than you'd think, less than you'd hope.
Yeah.
Well, a
Yeah.
lot, just probably not with our politics. I mean,
I think
oh no, go Nico, because my chapter is too small, so we don't have these issues. Or they're like, or we have issues with like too. I don't want to say too many liberals, because that's like the best. That's the best issue to have, but like we don't have like Trotskyist groups. I mean, which is like a part of the problem in the sense that like there's no left socialist. I mean, really, there's like no left tradition in the area I'm from. So like we're the only game in town for any kind of like even progressive politics, let alone, well, maybe not progressive, but like any kind of left politics. So it's a different situation here.
So Jeff, NOLA, I did a comparison between like areas where the DSA was further away from electoral power. NOLA is interesting in that regard. And I would say that when just casually speaking, and I have no idea if this is still true and it's totally ascientific, but like the New Orleans DSA was more radical than the DSA that I experienced in the areas around New York. And I found that interesting. Similarly,
what do you mean by more radical?
Well, more radical meaning like it was less interested earlier about, you know, doing a whole lot of stuff directly through the Democratic Party and staying in the Democratic Party. Like if you look at, for example, the caucuses around New York or the Bay Area, they actually on the spectrum of DSA tend to be more towards the what would be considered the social democratic, like right of the international, you know, whatever. Whereas if you look at a place like New Orleans, that there's a broader ideological spectrum in the DSA.
Yeah, there's a pretty broad ideological spectrum in New Orleans, and it's not a particularly sectarian one, or at least it hasn't been. We've never had locally a lot of the sort of like caucus problems that other places have had too. We don't really have a bread and roses contingent. We don't really have you know, socialist majority as far as that's like, you know, localized caucus. It doesn't particularly exist in New Orleans, and we don't have, you know, class unity folks. They might have some CUC folks, but they're not like visible in any meaningful way. But like in terms of like the work that we do, it's always been like how we define our chapter as opposed to the politics that we've had, which is like good and bad, I guess you say, because it feels like sometimes that there's like not a particular guiding like pathway forward. However, there is, I mean, we're one of the places as far as like, you know, people have critiques of mutual aid. But we were the first place to start doing like the brake light clinics years and years ago. And we've been able to sort of use that as not just like a mutual aid program. Like first off, I understand. I think that there is utility to that, to doing mutual aid sort of generally to build within the community, et cetera, et cetera. But like one of the things that we learned is that if you do a regular mutual aid like bright light clinic type process, you can develop new leaders and get people to get experience within the organization fairly reliably, and that's one of the things we've definitely not been like electorally particularly engaged, other than some like local ballot initiatives. I'm thinking specifically about the New Orleans city workers group that we have, which kind of spun off of our labor committee, which is, I have critiques of spinning off organizations from our labor committee as opposed to being like associated with the discipline of it to a certain extent, but there's give and take, and it's been very successful, so I'm not going to ask too many questions. The other sort of like electoral, the only ever endorsement like electoral we've ever made in New Orleans was an endorsement of Marguerite Green for state agriculture. Right there, that's their sign, for state agriculture commissioner, right? And she sort of didn't really have. She was probably the best candidate she ran as sort of a Democrat, and we have like kind of crazy primary system here where everybody runs at the same time, no matter which party you're in. So like, and if there's no majority, there's a runoff. It's called the jungle primary. I'm not sure if people are familiar with that. But Marguerite Green ran as she ran as an open socialist in the state of Louisiana. She got 250,000 votes. She didn't win, but she was able to start building statewide networks within the organization and start putting together what is essentially the bones of the Louisiana DSA. So that's some of the work that we do here. I hope I'm like addressing what you brought up.
You are. But that's what I mean by radical. I do not mean that they're necessarily sectarian. Like,
no, we're not sectarian. Like we have tendencies that exist. If there's, I mean, in terms of like caucus presence or whatever, like CPN is the one that I'm in, and like largely that's what dominates most of the like politics here. But it's not like it doesn't pervade the chapter, and we don't want to like create an atmosphere where like only CPN is like dictating the politics of the chapter. We want this to be a space where I hate fucking calling things spaces, but like we want it to be like a local that brings people in and doesn't like jealously guard power, I guess you could say.
Nico, I'm going to ask you, because your caucus was implicated in this. What the hell happened in Portland? I wish Jeremy was still here to tell me, because he's in Portland and could tell me. But why was the Portland delegation so contentious, and there was so much rule stuff back and forth between different factions?
The hell if I know. I wasn't paying attention to that.
All right. Well, it somehow involved a Class Unity Caucus person, maybe. Like,
I think that was just I think it's just a statement or something we put out, or a position I don't know if there's a CU person actually involved. I don't know how many people we have. Well, I don't know. I don't know.
How big are any of these caucuses? And then I'll let Paul talk, because I have no idea of that. Like, I know the org's huge, but I also know that like when I go to a meeting, let's say the DSA in Salt Lake City is like 400 or 500 people. I think it's more than that actually, but the max I've ever seen at a meeting is 60. And I think working groups are normally around 20 people. So to be involved in the caucus, don't you have to be fairly active in the organization?
So I'm not allowed to say how big Class Unity is, but most people are not involved in a caucus in DSA, period.
If you put all the caucuses together, it would be a minority of members of DSA.
Right. But the caucuses now play a disproportionate role in the national, right?
Well, because that's where like a lot of influencers are also in these.
But also,
when I say influencers, it doesn't necessarily mean like a media personality. It could just be someone that has like a large Twitter following because they have like access to information that like it's almost impossible to find other places.
If I might, really quickly, and I know you wanted to say something, Nico, so I'll be brief, but like the way that I think of the caucuses, at least at this point, is that it makes sense that they exist, and it's sort of like an organizational way to sort of amplify ideas and amplify perspectives and positions and in an organized way, which, yeah, it does have a disproportionate amount of influence in the organization. However, like, I see it as almost inevitable that that's going to take place. And it doesn't necessarily have to be like fine, you can call it factional or whatever, but like it doesn't have to be antagonizing, and it doesn't have to be hostile. And sometimes it plays out like that. Most of the time it doesn't. But unfortunately, when it comes down to when it comes down to conventions and elections, people decide like it's time for us all to go to war now. So, but in between conventions, it's often less tense. Go ahead.
Well, I think that it's weird because a lot of the influence that caucuses can have can seem to be like negative influence, precisely because they are a minority. That a lot of people aren't in caucuses and seem to just get their information off of like Twitter or something like that, and are greatly swayed by I would say like memes and that kind of rhetoric. Because at least from what I've heard, is that a lot of people just like in that non-caucus, like but still social media plugged in sphere, just informed their opinions by taking the opposite of whatever like Bread and Roses was doing, you know?
Yeah,
Well, caucuses,
defining your politics by literal reaction to your enemies. Like,
Yeah.
I do this to piss off my haters.
But isn't that most of American politics anyway? Go ahead, Paul.
Yes, it is.
The Portland thing, I mean, obviously I'm on the other side of the country, so I don't know the local details, but in brief, there was a delegate election in Portland where there were 3 members, one of whom was in class unity, who were not seated on the basis of a very arduous and unusual election in Portland that I don't want to go into. In brief, Portland asserted to National that they could run their local elections the way they wanted, and National said otherwise. And I was one of the people who thought that the National had a point, that Portland DSA violated its own rules in proceeding. But the point I want to make here is that only one of the 3 Portland delegates who was not allowed to be seated as a Portland delegate by Portland was in class unity. And other caucuses, because of the unfortunate, perhaps, media image of class unity caucus, seized on that and said, you know, this election was about keeping away the scarecourt class unity caucus people, even though it was only one of the 3 people. And that's a perfect example as any of how caucus politics actually works in practice. A lot of times, it's not about actual politics, it's about proxy fights and about people disputing politics through things like elections, but not in a transparent manner, or weaponizing accusations associated with one caucus against other people who are not in that caucus. And it's all very much like a cloak and dagger thing where it's hard to know who to trust when it comes to local controversies. And frankly, it boiled down to me to which side of the Twitter debate I trusted more. But I'm sure there's lots of people who took the other side, and it's a good example of why caucuses in general got a bad rap this convention, because people don't see caucuses as a positive good for internal democracy. They see caucuses as these cliques that snipe at each other and spread innuendos and possibly are undemocratically maneuvering behind the scenes.
I will say
So
this.
tragedy,
Oh, I'm sorry, Paul. I thought you were finished.
tragedy all around.
Okay, go ahead, Jeff.
I will say this, that like as far as getting guidance from like for the convention and how to vote on these like resolutions, going in as a unaffiliated delegate actually seems like more overwhelming than it would have been, and with with the caucus mates that I've had, one of the things that I can definitely say is that we were able in CPN, and I'm not like trying to like recruit anybody or whatever. It's not the point of it, right? But you got questions, ask me later. But like one of the things about it is that we did have an open part of our caucus that like literally poured over every single one of the resolutions and the amendments, looked at them all, came to some kind of conclusion on them, put that before the entire body of CPN. We voted on it as a body and approved it. So like we had a voter guide on how to vote on basically every resolution that we decided to take position on. And I thought that was extremely helpful for me as an individual delegate, because there's a lot of stuff going on, and I'm not omni person. Like I don't want to be, and I don't claim to be. But also it was something that when I could show to the Louisiana delegation, we actually acted as we basically acted in a very sort of a way that I liked. That the New Orleans delegation, the Southwest Louisiana delegation, the Baton Rouge delegation, and many of the others all communicated together at this convention, which I thought was really great. Made a lot of really great comrades. But I can also say, hey, here's an opinion on a lot of these resolutions. This is what this particular line is on it, and it's not to say support this or you suck or whatever, but like here's a perspective, take a look at it, and make your decision. And I thought that was extremely helpful for us generally. And
Well, that caucuses are where all I mean, like that's the benefit. I think like everything Paul says, right? But also caucuses are where you get like analysis about what's going on in the DSA. Like you go to CPN, you go to Bread and Roses, you go to the Tempest, you go to Socialist Majority. Like if you want to know what's going on, like what are like the people that are like active and in leadership, like are kind of like talking about, discussing, like try to understand the nuance, you go to a caucus publication or you listen to people on Twitter from those caucuses. And like the Portland thing, like there was like a really long report that was released and it's kind of like very nuanced, so I don't want to comment on that. But there's a lot of stuff like in the DSA, and I think on the left, I think it's human beings that like how we interact with each other when we start to get factionalized or form these identity groups. Doing democracy is actually not fun or easy, but it's necessary. And something that I think also comes up repeatedly, but we don't like have super like open conversations. The structures aren't neutral. And what happened in Portland was directly related to voting methods.
Yeah. So to expand on a lot of things that I want people to be clear on, I know some people in the comments are getting harsh on caucuses, like it's a sign of functional disunity or whatever. Historically speaking, the faction bans within socialist parties have been, some of them have been world historically bad, leading into, frankly, mass death. And some of that I actually do trace partly, although not entirely, into faction bans and banning internal competition within a party or socialist organization. Furthermore, I'd also say that like petty bullshit is the bread and butter of most human interaction, unfortunately, and it's something that you have to filter for. And it's actually one of the things that factions are slightly good at if you can keep your faction leadership from being the driver of the petty bullshit.
Yep.
So that's one of the things I was thinking, we were talking about the structure of DSA and like the director and director lead staffing and this that, and the other, and I was of two minds about it. And one of the things that I'm interested in is like is organizations that have non-politicized staffing issues, because it actually creates a division that is always justifiable from a kind of pragmatic calculus, but over time tends to destroy organizations. And the perfect example of this is the way most unions in the United States have taken union delegations, and they become less and less important to the professional staff within the union. And that staff is almost solely concerned about lobbying, actually not even about increasing the union membership, because it's irrelevant to how they get paid. It's something that an org is going to really have to think seriously about. Huh?
Ain't that
yeah, it's sad, right? Those of us in unions who are like, oh, God, the Uniserv people. But yeah, I mean, but it's also too much to ask volunteers to do it. I'll give you an example of that. I've tried to join the IDWW twice. And I say tried because no local could get me in, because all the staff is volunteer, and there was a local, like the recent chapter had like dissolved like a month before I came in, and so they just took my national money and then like couldn't finish registration, so of course I left the organization without ever really being in it. And that's the result.
I've heard that story so many times, by the way.
Yeah, it's happened a lot. It's not just me. It was one of these like, as a side note, this isn't relevant totally, but in 2013, I thought the IWW would be the good org for what happened with the DSA, because it has no pretension to being a party. And it has its relationship to the Democratic Party is a little bit clearer than the DSA's kind of muddled historical relationship. But when I tried to join, I realized why that wasn't the case. So
you can have perfect politics, but like, you got to be able to do stuff too.
Right.
That question is part of what's at the crux of one of the major industrial disputes going on right now here in New Zealand. The nurses, who are, I believe, set to go back on strike again in the near future. Their union, has an elected president, but also has a board of directors who are hired by the union. And it's been this ongoing, continuous fight between whoever the president winds up being and their support in the membership, and the board of directors, who are more or less just hired to run it and lobby, as to what the strategy with respect to the current campaign, which is for a national across the board rise in wages in all of the DHBs. DHBs are kind of the regional bits and pieces of our health system here. It's been this now years-long fight with the board of directors wanting to compromise at every turn, and an array of opinion among the membership. But it's something that is massively overcomplicated, a struggle that just has enormous public support. Either way.
Unfortunately, teacher strikes in the United States, which probably don't have as much public support, but still had more than was generally expected, had similar log jams. Both not I don't know about the ATF, but I know a lot of the NEA affiliates had to be forced to back the strikes pretty much by being drugged, kicking and screaming into backing the strikes by the people actually striking.
Well, in Chicago, it was shown that national leadership could be, or at least will, in Randy's case, will sort of opportunistically say, "Oh wow, Chicago teachers union's on strike. I'm going to show up in Chicago and say I've supported y'all the whole time." You know, like that's just one of the two moves that Randy does. The other one is, "Oh, I'm going to make a decision and say this is my personal." She did this fucking today on the news. She basically went and said, "I'm going to personally say my own personal opinion that," and this is actually not the worst thing that she's ever done, by the way. Like she personally said that I think all teachers should have get vaccinated, and essentially like the executive council of AFT covers her ass. You know, like that's the other move. But just to circle back, like leaderships of unions can be dragged kicking and streaming into these things, or I mean, it doesn't even have to be necessarily be in those terms. Like union leaders want to be seen as union leaders, and if there's a strike that's taking place, or if there's something that's got popular support on its side, and that they think that they can get their they think that they can sort of like raise their personal value, even in a certain sense, to be kind of extra cynical about it, they're gonna act on that. They'll act in their own interests.
But to talk about incentives about staffing and stuff, like a lot of uniserves and a lot of the actual like non representative parts of a union, they're paid whether or not the union is basically dying. I mean, like, and I don't know what to do about that, because I don't want to incentivize them. I don't want to be them on commission, but like, it's one of the ironies of like closed shop unionizing is it led to a lot of these people being really sclerotic, and then when that was removed, in a lot of places, and not even all totally right to work states, what immediately happened is like the unions hemorrhaging members, and the non-reps don't really care that much, which is kind of crazy. I say this because any political organization risks these kinds of structural incentives if you don't set it up correctly. And the DSA is revising its setup constantly because, the Harringtonite setup that was set up in the 80s, I think everybody acknowledges didn't really work. That's why there was the Constitution. That's why there was a bunch of reforms passed. I guess the big years for that were like 2015, 16, 17. Before the emergence of caucuses, but back in the big paper membership. And I say paper membership, and I don't mean that as an insult, because more paper members means, if you think about it, more money, and then a percentage of them will eventually get involved. But this leads us to the two things that I wanted to talk about that are a little bit more hard hitting, that plague. Most socialist groups don't have this problem because they never get big enough to have it. So I just want to point that out there. This is something that we can make analogous stuff to unions, or to civic groups, or to like the Kiwanis Club. But like, if you try to compare it to even the ISO, you're like, well, at most the ISO is what, 4,000 people in the United States who are active members. The DSA has an interesting problem in that it has just enough money to not have any money, which is a funny problem, but it's a real problem for the DSA. Part of it is that your fee structure is weird. Like, I was just looking at it today, and I'm like, so I can join for $15 a month, or $45 a year, or $750 for life, or for free. Now for free, I think if you can prove means, it's fine. If you can prove means, like it'd be like, okay, well, if you want free, you do have to like just, you don't have to show me your bank account, but like, show me some, like, what's your income bracket, etc. Right? You have to have some disclosure, I think, or you should. But like, it seems like a completely dysfunctional where it's like, pay what you want. Sometimes there's set amounts, kinda. Also, local dues vary wildly depending on what locals need, because of the other thing in the DSA fee structure is for the big locals, they get 20% of the dues back, and 80% goes to the national. And I think for smaller locals the ratio is higher in their favor.
And also the primacy of the national organization. I mean, you cannot have somebody pay local dues and have them be a member of your organization without paying national dues, which I think is great, but it's also like it's an interesting part of that balance.
Mm-hmm.
So like the way that we did it in New Orleans is we essentially implemented a voluntary local dues system because you can't mandate local dues either, which actually was pretty successful for us. We were able to raise a fair amount of money. I'm interested in, because you talk about the national budget, I guess is the way that you look at it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in what locals budgets do.
Yeah,
look like.
I would be interested in that too. I'm sure there's disclosure, but it's got to be in 1,000 different places.
I'll say this, that like, I mean, membership, it's literally in however many chapters there are, there's that many places that that numbers in. There might be like a centralized like super doc with that national has that they sort of like audit once a year or something like that. But I know that New Orleans is sitting on a certain amount of money that's I mean, I frankly think we should be spending more of it. And I think that like locals are nervous about like blowing their budget because they want to keep things going and they want to be prepared for any kind of expenses because they realize that national can't necessarily always bail them out if that happens. So I don't know.
It's also easy to blow money, kind of like you were saying, and from like a small chapter perspective, it's always like, is this the project we want to use our $1,000 on or whatever? And so like, we almost never, at least, for smaller chapters, you don't want to use it. And I don't know, like the financial structure. So it's weird because apparently with the massive membership increase, we're actually have quite a lot of just free floating cash now, but for a while we didn't. And so it's always kind of hard because
why is it so dependent on new membership though? Because you only increased, we
like doubled in size in the past, 2 years.
Did you?
Like
in Cape Cod?
No, not Cape Cod. I meant nationally. I think we went from
you were at 60,000. You were at 60,000 for 3.5 years ago. So you've had a massive increase. Yeah. The big jump is like between 2014 and 2016, like right up to Bernie. Then it was like exponential each year. Then there was a weird, in 2019 there was a stagnation.
Yeah.
But
then we had 100K drive, which I think was actually somewhat successful. Didn't quite get to that point, to that number, but I thought it was it was a effort of like bringing people in, and I think I talked about this with Jeremy. There was like no next steps for onboarding that were sort of cleared for new members until recently, but I don't know that that's necessarily a particularly big problem. But after that 100K campaign, membership sort of slowed to a trickle.
So there's a couple of things that I think that the DSA has to look forward to. Historically speaking, the only thing that's been like the DSA is the SDS. And I don't say this to be ominous, but the SDS hit around this number when you adjust for the population of the country and then immediately collapsed. For reasons of entryism, sectarian shenanigans, this, that, and the other. And again, I'm not against caucuses. I'm not against factions. I think faction bans historic. What happens with a faction ban actually is that it's just one faction dominates and lies about that they're dominating. So if what almost always happens with a faction ban, you just have Pareto rules start applying.
We're not there right now.
Yeah, you're absolutely not. And I think what the point is when you hit this kind of mass thing, it's a point of decision, and it's either gonna work or it's gonna not work. And one of the reasons why I asked the question about how should you be oriented, one thing is like what you're implying. The implication of what you just said, Michael, is that the DSA has a lot of stuff based on cash flow, but doesn't have a lot of steady like it's got it like. It can't depend on its membership fees of active members now, it has to have cash flow from new membership. Like, and if it doesn't, something starts happening to its budget. And like I said this off air, but I'll say it on air. Its budget's pretty transparent. The only thing you can't really see is what the individual consulting firms are doing. You can look it up. They even put it on a stupid Patreon. It's weird. But you can find it, and I have, because I talk shit about the DSA all the time, so I figured I'd actually know what I was going to talk about.
I think that it's a little bit more complicated than that, because what we make staff, or what we dedicate staff to, is decided at convention. So it's not like sometimes when people talk about, well, when I say that, I mean it's not like you. So maybe the PRO Act, it was kind of weird use of, I don't want to say weird use of money, but that wasn't a convention thing. But it's the convention. What happens, at least in the past 2 I've gone, we just pass a whole bunch of stuff, and then we're like, okay, well, this resolution says we're going to have a full-time staff or 2 full-time staff. We're going to dedicate this much money for chapters to do that. And sometimes I think people think that it's just national is just kind of willy-nilly doing whatever the hell it wants, and it's not quite that simple.
I would totally agree with you. I used to think that, but now I don't. Yes, Jeff.
I mean, the way that money flows out more than anything else is through our national committees. I mean, we have a labor commission, a DSLC, we have an international committee, and we have a mutual aid working group, nationally speaking. We have a lot of these national bodies that, I mean, I talk to people. Sometimes there's gatekeeping. Sometimes they're dying for people. I think it's a situational thing. For the DSLC situation, which I think is to its detriment, the steering committee of that is elected, which makes it very difficult for people to just jump into. I've been wanting to be a part of national labor strategy for a very long time, but it's just not always super accessible. But these national committees and these national working groups are where a lot of those decisions where the non-administrative, I guess you could say, money goes. So and that's key.
Yes, Paul.
I want to build off something that Michael said.
Oh, growth and development. Sorry, growth and development. I forgot to mention that one. Go ahead.
So Michael was talking about being in a small chapter with X amount of money and not wanting to spend it. And I also am from a small chapter, and the last time I checked, my chapter was relatively financially healthy. I mean, I'm not in chapter leadership, so don't quote me on that, but I believe my chapter is doing relatively okay money-wise. But as far as I know, we're not really spending it on anything. So I would say, from my experience and from talking to other people in smaller chapters, there's a real reluctance to commit to big projects, because any big project could be seen as breaking the small local organization. And I think it's different in large chapters where, like New York, I know they're spending lots of money because they have the largest chapter in the country. But, I don't know. I feel like there was a general atmosphere of fear, both in local chapters and in the national organization as a whole, some of which we saw during this convention, where there's a reluctance to make certain bold steps, even when we have the resources. And resources are almost always discussed in the context of scarcity, even when there is not, in fact, a scarcity issue. I feel like people have this bunker mentality that is to our detriment, that I certainly have seen in my smaller chapter, and perhaps is a problem for others as well. I mean, it might not be the most financially prudent thing, but there's a flip side to having a positive cash flow, which is if you have a positive cash flow, you probably should be spending it on something.
So there's a lot to pick apart there. Taylor, you want to say anything?
Yeah, I've got to ask, when it comes to election time, is the money that's going into campaigns primarily coming from national, or do locals stump up the money for a local campaign? Because as a socialist, that elections are by far and away, like by a massive degree, the most expensive thing you can possibly do. It completely financially ruined multiple of the largest socialist groups that have existed here.
In my
recent
experience,
decade.
fundraising is like there can be certain amounts of chapter funds given to campaigns, but most of it's fundraising, like fundraise, like for the campaign.
Right.
Yeah.
That changed my opinion on the DSA when I realized that 2 years ago, because when I thought national money was going directly into national lobbying campaigns, I was like, not only not going to pay you, I was going to fight you tooth and nail. But when I discovered by doing the research that was not the case, at least not directly, there's some indirect things that it kind of provides, but that I took a more neutral stance. The one thing I will say though is everything that we talk about talks to scale. I mean, one of the things I used to talk to IWW people, and I love the IWW, I truly do, but I used to say, well, my business union can provide me insurance.
Right.
You can't. In fact, all that you really do for me is ask for things. Now, as a socialist, because I'm an ideologically committed weirdo, I might actually give you those things. But if I was, say, a neutral party who maybe was sympathetic to socialism, but you got to pay the dues, it's something that I think prior social organizations, the SPA in America, the SPD in Britain, early labor, understood that and had mutual aid was not just charity, it was also building institutions that could self-sustain and provide
Bingo!
like
Fucking bingo!
like social insurance. And you did start it with charity drives. I mean, like, that was the beginning. However, there's a converse side to that I think we do have to look at. The SPD, even though it still exists, was functionally destroyed by the fact that during its height of power before the rise of the Nazis, it had so much fucking staff. Like, when I tell you how it had like something like double the staff of labor in the UK now. You know, and we're talking about a socialist party in the teens and 20s. That was also a problem, by the way, for the SPUSA, which was bankroll. It was actually a good way if you were like a, you know, particularly a black working class person who wanted anything like a middle class life. Being a CPUSA staffer in the 40s and 50s was actually a way to make a living. I'm not saying that's good or bad. It's just a fact. We don't have anything like that. Part of that's because cost disease, and a lot of the stuff that we would actually operate in, stuff is way more expensive, even adjusted for inflation, than it was 50, 60 years ago to do. The kinds of scales that you're looking at are way higher, et cetera, and so forth. So that's a real problem that any socialist organization has. But it's something.
I was gonna say our staffers are actually really expensive. Not that they don't deserve it, but like when you look at the cost of what one staffer is, it's a lot of money.
Well, if your staffer's in New York, I mean, that's another thing. If like your main organization is New York,
they're unionized. So I think it's a. I could be wrong. I think the amount of money they get paid is the same no matter where they are, because they're not all in New York. Because they're regional staffers.
So you kind of have to pay for the most expensive locality then for everyone.
Right.
Yeah. And then there's healthcare. And all the other.
Well, I mean, benefits, whatever you take this. I mean, this is one thing that I used to tell people when they would talk about the declining rates of worker pay, and I'd be like, "Have you?" And I do think worker pay has declined. Don't get me wrong, but benefits costs are often not talked about in that context. This is one of the arguments. I'm going to become dark Marxist here and just talk about profitability rates and stuff. But like, it's one of the arguments about profitability rates is a whole lot of cost of staffing is hidden. And I don't say that to be, sympathetic to the capitalist, but when you're running an organization that's even a nonprofit, you have to deal with it, right? And so what if, say, even if you're only paying your staff for $40K, which would be kind of low in New York, that's going to be another 20, 25, 30K in benefits minimum. And that's expensive. I mean, I work at a school, right? Like, now there's some dark stuff that, but like, even as low as we pay teachers, we're the majority of the cost of education. Like, only 7% of the budget goes into non-personnel in any given school system in the United States. Now, there's other stuff in that because administrative cost disease and administrative tripling is a large reason why it costs double what it used to educate one kid, while teachers' pay has actually declined. But it's still the truth that personnel costs are the biggest costs that you're going to have. Which is also why elections are so goddamn expensive, because you need not only all the stuff you need to do to build elections, but you also either need people to work for free, which is a lot of it, or you need separate staffing campaigns for that. That's also why in democracies, elections tend to become, if they're not publicly financed, the domain of the rich by just attrition. So
even with public financing, which you get in New Zealand, they're still extraordinarily expensive. To draw an example, in 2008, the Workers' Party, which was as they put it, Trotsky sympathetic but not Trotskyist, and Mao sympathetic but not Maoist, which is a mouthful, but they ran a propaganda campaign in 2008, and even with public funding for advertising, which you get here, and with no paid staff, they spent $10,000 on that campaign, which is all good and well until you bring up the Workers' Party had 35 members. So even with volunteer work, even with public funding, even with ideal conditions, and in New Zealand, the threshold for getting into Parliament is 5% of the vote. Even with a lot of stuff working your way, it is still prohibitively expensive and almost just can't be done.
Yeah,
unless you have a very advanced organization.
And New Zealand's tiny. I mean, just to put it in the perspective, comparing it to the United States,
it's about the size of South Carolina.
Yeah, it's
Although our largest city would, if it was in the US, would be the 6th largest city in the US, because a quarter of our population is in one city.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, this is why it's hard for, when we talked about the electoral stuff and why like most of our money doesn't go to it, is because like even like small campaigns cost a shit ton. And like on the flip side, like that's why we have very little kind of control over our reps, because they don't need us for money. Like some of them need us for like volunteer labor, because that's what DSA definitely is to a lot of folks, and especially a lot of fake socialists. And I feel safe saying that, because they're like, there are plenty of people that come in, not plenty, but there are definitely people that come into our org just so they can get free labor pool of volunteers. And like you're saving someone a lot of money if you can get 10, 15 people to volunteer for you. Because canvassers aren't cheap if you have to pay for them, even when you're not paying them well. $15, $20 an hour adds up real quick. But that it's hard, because if you want to do stuff professionalized, if you don't want it to just be volunteer work, you need a lot of cash to do stuff. And if you want to be the source of funding for these folks, and even then it's hard with election laws, because usually you can't just be the direct source of funding too. So
that's the thing that. So no, you go. No, I've already spoken.
I was just thinking that in terms of like institutions and stuff that the DSA could do to attract members and provide a revenue source for this stuff. I'm wondering if we should take a closer look at like digital services and stuff. I mean, so much of like software production is done by hobbyists now, but the reason software companies still a thing is because you need to pay people to do that stuff. If there were perks like I don't know, you had access to it's really late, so these kind of things are escaping me. But like if you got the kinds of stuff you got from like a Microsoft 365 account by signing up for DSA, that'd be a reason to sign up for DSA, you know, and we could probably provide it for less than a Microsoft 365 account if we got it running.
Wasn't there a resolution that tried to do that, or tried to get some non-corporate thing like Van? Because Van,
you can reconstruct Van, like have DSA reconstruct Van. Like we don't have the money and we don't have the manpower to make that happen right now.
That wouldn't be a revenue source immediately.
Oh no, not for revenue, but it would be a way of saving money, and also that like there's a lot of stuff that goes into it. But if you're talking about like using that to sell to folks, I don't know. I think that gets into a weird place if we become like a tech company.
Yeah, well, yeah, any kind of digital aid can also runs the risk of either NGOification or petty bourgeois business. I mean, that's just true. That's kind of a fact. Last question, and so those of you at the East Coast can finally go to fucking bed. It came up multiple times in several different cases today, and it's been implied in some of the stuff we talked about here. A lot of people think the grievance procedure in the DSA is broken, that it was designed to stop things like what happened in the ISO, where there was, culty organizations with no grievance procedures, and that were effectively brought down by their own subsidiary businesses, but which amuses me to no end. But that the structure that it has is there to protect the organization, not any individual member of it. It's not aligned towards truth or anything like a legal procedure, and that it might be a bad model for a political organization, and something that actually you don't see like the Democrats and Republicans doing internally. Would anyone like to speak to that grievance procedure? Yes, Jeff.
So, unfortunately, and this is like truly, like genuinely unfortunate. Like it's like make me like worried about the future of the organization, even to the point where there's two strains of like, well, it's like one, but it's sort of like it's this convergence of this line of thinking of like tension and debate and political differences are hard, and technical like grievance procedures are very easy and very clear. So what I've noticed takes place sometimes, and I'm not going to point out any particular situations and circumstances, but I know that people who are members of DSA, especially people that I've talked about, I don't want to like name any names, but they'll say that when a political disagreement comes up, as opposed to addressing that agreement on the terms that agreement exists within, the grievance procedure essentially uses a workaround to eliminate sort of political, people that you politically disagree with, and it's a HR type of approach to these kinds of things, like literally kind of like calling the manager version of dealing with your problems. And like obviously there are grievances and horrible, terrible things that happen with an organization of 90 something thousand people. That's a lot of people. There's going to be abuse in that set. However, like the problem becomes, when that system is exploitable towards political ends, to take essentially political shortcuts, people will take it. And that's all I'm going to say on that point.
Yes, Paul.
I agree. I think the operative phrase for much of this convention would be weaponized grievance. That is, I think Jeff is right. I think more than once this convention, caucuses took advantage of the ease of the process to do like an October surprise, releasing information very suddenly at the last minute against candidates they didn't like.
I don't even know. I don't even know if that was necessarily a caucus directly that was involved in that, but certain individuals. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I mean, even literally the individual who wrote the national grievance policy, or one of the individuals who co-wrote the national grievance policy, said on Twitter that she was shocked at the manner in which it was being used. And I know that this year, the one of the proposals that was being voted on, the National Council of Grievance Officers thing, one of the things that was stated by National was that the NPC was sick of getting constant grievance stuff getting mailed to them that was clearly not an actual grievance, that was just petty politics. And yeah, I think it's depressing. I think I don't have an answer for it. But I would agree with other comrades that the grievance procedure as it presently exists is, as Jeff said, very easy to use and has been used in nefarious ways. On the flip side, there's also problems like my chapter where we don't even have a grievance officer. So, I mean, sometimes, I don't know. I guess my chapter has existed okay so far, but we're technically supposed to have one. And God forbid something happens in my chapter, we would have to call national because we don't have a way of resolving it. So I think it's one of those, like, it's like a hit of quicksand or an oil slick or a bunch of molasses. It's very sticky, very difficult to resolve. And I think it will be one of the trickiest issues going forward for the organization. And one last thing, I will say that I think as socialists, a lot of people are hyper aware of the harassment process because even for people who aren't necessarily plugged in, people are aware of what's gone on in like various UK organizations, like the Socialist Workers' Party, revolutionary socialism in the 21st century. What was it in the? There's like 3 different UK examples I can name off the top of them.
I can think of 5 US examples, frankly.
Yeah.
But yeah. I mean, it is interesting because it seems like we've been given a choice between corporate institutionalism and nothing in like central committee abuse, which is a very that's those are two. Both of those are shit sandwiches. Like, there's no good in either one of those things, other than maybe one protects some people, sometimes kind of, but is so weaponizable that it eventually undoes itself and undoes the seemingly popular legitimacy of the grievance process, which would be very bad for people actually harassed, harmed, and otherwise abused in the organization if the grievance process uses all popular legitimacy. So, Jeff, you wanted to say on that, and then Michael.
No, I mean, like, well, no, I just want to say that, and this is something I'm very close to, so I'm not going to bring up the specific situation, but one of the members of the MPC, currently on the MPC, was essentially like disqualified from running for MPC like days prior to the convention and the run up to Friday, because they were named in a grievance, and essentially that was a decision that was made by the previous outgoing NPC that they because they were part of this grievance, they couldn't run for the NPC, and it was like it was a decision that was overturned. Thank goodness, I think, by the convention. But like, even if I didn't know this person personally, and even if I didn't like support this person and like agree with their politics and know them and think them as a close friend and comrade, that's a horrible way for somebody to be by being a part of this process without having that process play out, have a consequence be meted out upon you.
So just being
but also
in the process. So if I'm understanding you correct, no decision had been made by the grievance.
Other than the grievance, the NPC decided that the grievance was legitimate, but no investigation had taken place. Other than that, as far as I can tell, there was no conclusion to the investigation. To be
right,
clear.
so the investigation was not complete, and so the grievance process was in process, but there was still a penalty before any final decision had been made, other than a legitimate grievance had happened,
which is easily weaponizable, right?
Right, because you don't need to prove anything.
By being a part of this process, you cannot. You're disqualified from participating in this organization as an equal. Then why would you not just engage somebody in that process?
Right, because there's no cost if the process finds that the grievance, even if the grievance is legitimate, but the parties you've accused of didn't do it or whatever, there's no cost to tying someone up, and they're out. If you do it at the right time, they're out of the running for this, that, or the other.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think the timing is one of the crucial things there, because I'm not familiar with this person or anything at all. I just saw this pop up on Twitter from Class Unity, or what the notifications I got about it. And like the NPC pulled this after the convention started, and you just see they're being voted out, so they're replaced, and you just can't do that. You just can't say no. You can't run after you're like it's such a clear conflict of interest.
I think though, to kind of play devil's advocate, as I like to do, and listen, procedural justice person here, like I'm 99%. I mean, the whole weekend's been a blur, but I'm like 99% sure I voted to let her back on and against the NPC for procedural grounds. The flip side is, imagine if the NPC had let folks run, and then we found out that they were all like serial abusers, the shitstorm that it would cause, which I think is, again, I disagree. No, I know. But it's one of those things where I don't know how much of this is like because there is a concern for how the organization looks, and then it's like, oh, DSA just let because honestly, the three people that were
people remember Fatante.
Yeah, three people that were named. Well, one got elected. I'm pretty sure the other two would have been elected as well. I think personally they were
like Fern would have gone on, and Ryan,
but Fern wasn't named in the allegation.
He wasn't named, but he resigned, because never mind.
But yeah, and I mean, like, and again, I disagree with that, but like that's my like trying to understand why they would do it.
You're exploring the thought process. I mean,
because like some of them,
like the NPC that made the decision, are not irrational people. Many of them, I mean,
and they're friends with some of the people. And they're friends with some of the people that they co-signed on. Like, I think like Genbo, for instance, because I kind of follow people on Twitter, is like decent friends with Blanca, I think. And I think she signed on to the signature. I mean, this is getting like really internal politicky, but like, that's why like, I don't think it was quite as like Machiavellian, like trying to do this like deep politics. I think the letter was probably trying to do that, but I don't think the NPC. But again, like, yeah, this is the problem, like procedural justice. You can't just do that because it sets a horrible precedent.
That's the point. Yeah.
And I will say, like, and for people that are watching this and not in DSA, I think like the thing to also keep in mind is that we know these are problems and we're actively trying to figure them out. And that also, this is probably not a good thing, but that like this isn't actually something specific to the left. This is a human thing. When I was talking about it with one of my comrades, I brought up Elizabeth Warren, knife and Bernie in the back, like in the primaries, right? Like just completely out of nowhere. And again, I think it's just a human thing to do. But as an organization, we can't allow it to happen. And, but I think that hopefully we're trying to develop these processes and try to figure out how you deal with these. Because I know myself, I've had comrades that, had political disagreements, but were also incredibly uncomradely in those political disagreements at times. And it's like, oh, is that a grievance issue? Should you just do mediation, or is that like just like, oh well,
it's not always clear.
Yeah, and that's where the other hard thing is. Sometimes it is like someone's being a dick, and also they disagree with you, and it's not always cut and dry, and that's why these processes are really hard.
I would say as a kind of final thought, and then I'm gonna let Taylor talk and we'll finish up so everybody on the East Coast can finally go to bed. Thank all of you for participating. I think the grievance culture stuff, I don't think is unique to the left. I think it is generally human, but I will also say we have more problems with it than a lot of other groups. Partly because I think we are more aware and willing to acknowledge certain kinds of grievances that other organizations and other kinds of social formations just don't deal with. But the converse of that is that it is highly weaponizable, and we are often in denial about its weaponization, frankly, for talking points in the general public that, stuff like trust victims or whatever, which as a sentiment I agree with, as actual policy.
Not as easy as that.
Yeah, I mean it's not, and it's easy for one side to. It's actually easy for powerful people to weaponize it, pretty easily
because they control all the levers of power.
All right. But and I also don't think it's remotely unique to the DSA to have this problem. I think every socialist org I've ever seen has either this problem or the opposite problem, which is abuse cover-ups of a massive scale all over the place. Like, it does seem like we have found a way socially, at least in the United States, to easily handle these problems in a way that has any kind of procedural fairness.
Not unique, and it's not unsolvable.
Right. It's not unsolvable. It's not unique, but it is something you have to admit is an actual problem to fix it. And I think, I think this convention, as people have said, probably does look better to the general public and to the DSA than 2 years ago, which apparently was so acrimonious that everybody thought it was a general cluster. I actually didn't bother following it because everything I heard from it sounded so ridiculous that I didn't believe any of that actually happened. And apparently some of it actually did. So it was one of those things. But
it got overplayed when you have like three long days and you pull out like a 30-second clip of people that are like hungry, tired, emotionally charged.
I don't know. As a libertarian communist, which is a contradiction in terms that I don't actually believe in. I both agree that you have to come with people in yarn, and I also agree that sometimes you need some fucking collective discipline. God damn it! So like,
in terms of procedural discipline, just to make like another point, this was actually an extremely well managed affair. Much of like to get like a little bit like nuts and boltsy, like. It might have seemed a little bit like authoritarian because of the sort of like interface and the technology involved. But I mean, I thought it was, I think they addressed, the chairs specifically addressed, the issues that were brought up in a fair way, as could be expected in this particular kind of like almost entirely, remote type situation. And I really do want to, shout out the chairs, the tech committee, and Walker Green almost specifically. absolute fucking machine chairing like yesterday and today. Unbelievable.
All right. And at the last instance, I said I was going to give it to Taylor, our international watcher, who's coming in from New Zealand, and sat quietly through us blabbing for 2 hours in the other stream.
I can only imagine how many notes Taylor took.
From an even more outside than me, from the land of hobbits and sheep, and which is the way we view New Zealand. As a side note, I have a lot of Newfie communist friends, but my one memory is getting in bar fights with you over rugby, with you as in Kiwis over rugby, because I called them Australian in Korea. So that's been my and you guys hit hard.
Yeah. I gave whoever it was a pretty solid reason to hit. So
yeah, I may or may not have kicked him in the kneecaps because I don't play fair. So good old international violence aside, what are some final observations you'd like to tell your American comrades about what you've seen tonight?
I mean, on the convention itself, I will say that the 2019 convention, I don't know, at least in perception, we'll say, was enough of a clusterfuck that people in the wider left in New Zealand were talking about it, not just like random sickos like me who follow this stuff all over the place for whatever perverse reason. Whereas this time around, they weren't paying attention at all, or not that I've seen. However, the people that do pay attention to the goings-on of socialists in other countries had mostly productive things to say. They were interested in what was actually being debated and the resolutions actually being passed, etc., etc. So as far as, giving as almost as outside a possible perspective, it seems to have run a lot better as far as we're concerned than the 2019 one. The thing that interests people from outside of the States about the DSA is that it's the most prominent socialist organization in the US by far, and it also seems to be the one that's most focused on electoralism. And from, I think, most speaking from kind of an Anglospheric perspective, but most people view the US as being the single country where any kind of electoral strategy would be, the largest boulder to push up the hill. So in that respect, people outside of the US see that as being this very counterproductive and deliberately difficult strategy to pursue. But in that respect, the fact that there's anything that could be called some kind of electoral breakthrough at all in the States does interest people here who have some kind of electoral strategy, because it's such a large boulder to push up the hill. And there's in New Zealand and in Australia, and I think in a few other countries, there's nothing really like the DSA here, not even in like a UK kind of militant momentum way. You just don't have anything here that orients itself either as an interest or a dual carder or a dual carder or whatever towards our Labour Party or towards our Green Party. So that it's a strategy that just isn't done here, which makes it interesting to watch. There isn't the other thing is just the fact that the US doesn't have like a really shit Labour Party. That's a part of the spectrum that just doesn't exist in the US. So when people here are looking at, the actual policies of the overall political perspective of the party that DSA is trying to have this inside-out strategy, it most resembles our centre-right party than our centre-left party. which makes kind of the Bernie campaign very funny because Bernie was almost certainly to the left of our center-left party. So
Bernie's way to the left of DSA. By the way, like super to the left of DSA.
Well,
yeah, it is funny because they're
Mildly concerning. But go ahead.
wait, did you say Bernie's to the left of the DSA?
Yeah. Without hesitation.
Let's not open another can of worms. It's already too late.
Oh, okay.
Go on.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'll let it stand. I actually, from the outside, I actually think I agree with Jeff, believe it or not, as a person who would be horrified by someone saying Bernie was to the left of me. Like, that would be fighting words, and I would probably kick you in the kneecap. But, like, this is going to be a running joke now.
it is funny because so we have the Ardern government, which was re-elected last year, and
which liberals
Ardern's-
love over here, by the way. Like,
exactly.
they love-
Ardern is kind of like a centrist liberal darling. But over here, because of entirely aesthetic, kind of surface level presentation, Ardern, and also there's been some very significant successes for the Green Party here in the last election. Both of them were compared to the Bernie surge, even though Bernie was proposing policies that our Labour government would shoot down in a heartbeat. And our Labour government has basically been running on, we're going to promise a lot and do absolutely nothing for, the entirety of this government. So it is very funny seeing, extraordinarily crossed wires when there's any kind of like communication between people here and people. And
Sorry.
exactly that, actually. Have a really shit Labour Party or a Social Democratic Party and feel bad about it like the rest of us.
Well, if it makes Kilgore Kraut feel any better, like we are miserable at least.
Yeah.
Well, that makes me feel better.
Yeah. Like,
Yeah, miserable without the healthcare or universal healthcare.
You can have our universal healthcare, but it comes with rheumatic fever because all of our housing is shit.
ooh.
We love a trade-off, don't we, folks?
I remember when Americans couldn't immigrate to New Zealand because most Americans couldn't meet their BMI requirement to get the universal health care. I'm actually not even joking. That was real 10 years ago. Which just made me laugh. There's a certain romance that American liberals, even some American leftists, have with the Anglophone center left, particularly now New Zealand, which I find particularly hilarious given how small New Zealand is in the scale of politics. But also with Corbyn and this, that, and the other. And occasionally with Canada and in the NDP, which, like, you want to feel sad, like, learn about what it's like to be in Canada and the NDP. But because of it does actually, though, the irony of this, it comes out of desperation because we don't have any historical labor representation. The Democratic Party is almost a pre-capitalist party. It's like it is the oldest voter-based party on the goddamn planet. Now there are political parties that are older, but they're not voter-based. So it's like a relic from almost the beginnings of capitalism.
It's medieval.
Yeah, it is close, actually. I mean, the Democratic Party, if you trace it all the way back to the Democrat Republicans, comes out of like 1780, like 1790 something. It's that old. So it's, we don't have a labor tradition. Our Labor Party got squashed in the 19 teens and 20s, actually, ironically, because of World War One, because all of its leadership was in prison for being anti-war, and it died. It effectively had to go into the Democratic Party and never developed an independent consciousness.
What's interesting is that's what birthed our Labour Party, was the fact that they had all been imprisoned, because that gave them so much. Not to do like a history lesson, but immediately before the war, there was New Zealand's largest and most serious strike, the General Strike of 1913, which led to basically everyone who would go on to be involved in the Labour Party for its first 30 years being imprisoned and doing hard labour, and a bunch of them were immediately re-imprisoned in World War I because the incipient Labour Party, which was founded in 1916 here, took an anti-war line, so they all got arrested, and some of them were in jail. and being surveilled for like 10 years after the war ended. But because they had demonstrated that all of this newfound kind of electoralism didn't mean that they weren't willing to put their name to principle and do quite literally hard yards, that meant that the Labour Party, which went through a very rapid process of softening coming out of the back of what was essentially a revolutionary industrial syndicalist movement, kind of had the cred to draw in a lot of the working class. So it just had completely the inverse effect here. It made them cool.
Yeah,
It also helps that we do have legends of early Labour figures who would go do like stand-up soapbox sort of stuff to workers' meetings, pissed, like barely coherent, pissed drunk, just absolutely incapable of cohering anything. But that made them seem more fun and interesting than any of the other electoral options, so it worked in their favor.
So our problem in the United States is a lot of our labor leadership was frankly fucking shot.
Yes.
like it wasn't, they didn't get arrested. That was only for like Debs, and I'm not talking about the Socialist Party so much, but the labor movement. They would just send they would send Pinkertons after them and bomb them, and with federal imperator to turn their head towards it. And then you have the complications of race and being highly federated. Like we're barely when I say this, it's the United States is almost unique in that we have a super powerful federal government, but also like our federal government has no power simultaneously. Like we could blow up.
It has immense power to circle funds and delegate that power that it has,
and blow shit
It's
up.
very similar to Australia in that sense, which is also a federation.
Yeah, I think it's interesting because I've always found that Australians and Americans hate each other a whole lot as far as former Commonwealth countries go, but that we're actually very similar in a lot of our assumptions and our settler colonialism and our weird federated government and so what are you gonna do? You got to feel better than somebody, and Americans are pretty easy to feel better than, and they're also super rich on the world scale, so I get it. And on that note, let's let people go to bed. Thank you guys so much. If you were a poor sod who did this for 4 fucking hours, Jeff, Nico,
I've been looking at screens all day. I can't get enough of it. I've become one with the screen.
Oh, did you have to teach tomorrow?
Yep. First day was.
You're insane.
Real champ right there.
Can I plug GMC real quick?
Yeah, of course you can.
Yeah, check out Good Morning Comrade. We actually got JC coming on the show tomorrow night. JC from Connecticut. Gonna have her coming on, JC DSA on Twitter. And we're gonna run that show on Tuesday morning at 8:00. But you can go to twitch.tv/Good Morning Comrade Radio and smack us a follow.
All right. Anyone else want to plug anything on their way out?
Yeah, join DSA.
All right.
Yeah.
That's a good one.
You got the joiners. All right. Good night. And again, thank you so much.